Welcome to the breakout session on Beyond Methods. I'm Rose Cairns from the University of Sussex, and I'm going to be helping to facilitate today's session with Marina Apgar from the Institute of Development Studies. Our theme for discussion is this question of whether sustainability research, and particularly action-oriented transdisciplinary transformations research, requires a radical reconceptualization of methods, and if so, what might that look like? How might we shift away from methods as ordering, extracting, replicating and validating devices of the academy? So by way of a very brief background before I hand over to Marina to introduce our panel, methods conversations, as many of you will already know, and as Melissa outlined during her opening remarks, have always been very central to the STEP Centre's mission, particularly around revealing and challenging the imprints of power on knowledge and working to counter singular narratives as expert-led optimal solutions to complex sustainability challenges. So the eagle-eye view, or the experts speaking truth to power. And STEP's researchers have a long history of thinking about, exploring and experimenting with ways in which particular methods and associated practices might hold the potential to open up, change processes to plural knowledges, to acknowledge and appreciate the diverse possible pathways to sustainability associated with these. This year, along with colleagues in UNAM in Mexico and ARIN in Kenya, we, the STEP Centre, have been convening a series of events and conversation around the theme of methods in our challenging research series. And for any of you interested in following these kinds of discussions, many of them were recorded and are available on the STEP's website. The title of today's session, Moving Beyond Methods, in a way also describes the kind of trajectory of discussions we've been having over this year, which quite naturally moved us beyond discussion of methods in terms of particular tools, techniques and practices, and kind of deeply into discussions around coloniality and knowledge systems and institutions and relationships, discussions about researcher roles and positionalities, discussions about methodological infrastructures, so these so-called academic backstages of the sometimes invisible disciplinary and institutional structures, cultures and hierarchies that condition research and researchers, and discussions of the personal, relational dimensions of transdisciplinary research practice. Particularly counter to calls from some quarters that challenges of sustainability requires a more professionalized, unified, disciplined, singular sustainability science, associated perhaps with more standardized methodologies. The discussions that we've been having this year and over the course of the life of the STEP Centre, I think sustainability transformations research really emerges as a process that's more collaborative, relational, often deeply personal, obviously political, polyvocal and inherently in some ways messy. Which brings us back to this central question. If we view transformations research in this way, what are the implications for our thinking and practice around methods? Does sustainability research require a radical reconceptualization of methods? So that's it for introduction. And in keeping with STEP's emphasis on diverse pathways, we've asked today's panel to reflect on their own pathways or their personal journeys in terms of how their thinking and practice around methods has changed or evolved over time, to consider together what continue to be the thorniest challenges or tensions in their methodological practice. So I'm going to hand over to Marina now, who's going to introduce our panelists.
Thanks a lot, Rose. Hi, everyone. I'm Marina Apgar, based at the Institute of Development Studies, and it's been a great pleasure to work with Rose and others this year, facilitating this conversation about methods. So exactly as Rose has said, we've asked our wonderful panel to share some of their own personal journeys, and that's also because when we talk about methods, we want to get into the zone of praxis, and it's really good to kind of situate that in the realities that people have been engaging with. So we're first going to hear from Andy Stirling, who I'm sure many of you know, who is the co-director of the STEP Centre, and he's Professor of Technology and Policy at the Science and Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, and is responsible for some of the thinking around methods in STEPs. We'll then hear from Injairu Kulundu. Hi, Injairu, welcome. Who is a decolonial scholar, writer, musician, and trickster practitioner, who's learning how to alchemize binary-based logics towards a paradigm of non-duality. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Environmental Learning Research Centre at Rhodes University in South Africa, and is part of the Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures Research Network. I'm particularly interested in hearing more about how Injairu reimagines the practice of decolonial love. And then our third speaker is David Manuel-Navarrete. Hi, David. An associate professor in the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University, who works on socio-ecological and technological systems in Latin America, with a focus on unsustainability of the colonial onto-epistemologies promoted by Eurocentric academia. And his action research with indigenous biocultural systems in Ecuador and other parts of Latin America, promoting decolonization and consciousness-based transformation and the emergence of ecocentric and kin-centric economies. So what a fantastic group that we're going to hear from. And so before we kick off, please just to say to everybody in our audience, please do use the chat to share any questions you have or thoughts that pop up as you hear Andy, Injairu, and David speaking. Because we'll have some time to actually come to those, and hopefully we can hear some of your perspectives. So thank you very much to Andy, Injairu, and David for joining, and I'll hand over to you, Andy, and then you can pass on to the others for your excuse me, for your 5 minutes each.
Great, thanks Marina, thanks Rose. Good golly, what a discussion so far even. My mind's already buzzing, but yeah, I've got the job of talking a little bit about the step center journey, and as we've already heard, journey metaphors are pretty fashionable nowadays, and it's notorious that you can actually use them to describe just about anything, but I do think they're really applicable in the case of the work of the Step Center and its partners on methods over the years. Maybe it's not a question of a journey from A to B so much as a journey of exploration, but I'll come to that. So collectively and individually, certainly thinking about myself, it's been a really amazing journey over the last 15 years in how we understand and practice research, activist scholarship, methods. We began looking as a way to critically engage with the positivist cultures around natural science, and we started out for that reason emphasizing implications of complexity and uncertainty, and how forces of power and privilege within and around science pressurize this premature closure and blind our eyes to the implications, and of course in the process especially blinding out the interests of the most marginalized people. And we looked for methods to resist these pressures, to help this sort of buzzword that sometimes becomes a little bit of a trope, to open up political spaces for appreciating alternative meanings of sustainability and pathways to these. And the results have been pretty well received. They sometimes do a fairly good job of bridging between quantitative and qualitative and analytic and participatory and natural and social science. But the journey we've been on has been quite profound. It's not so much been away from these conclusions, but about steadily applying these same values and insights more deeply and effectively to ourselves and our own practice. And it's opened up our attention then to ways in which maybe some of the earlier work was just skittering along the surface, that transdisciplinarity we've already heard quite a bit about is not just a desirable thing that when you think about it, it's actively suppressed, not least by disciplinary hierarchies. And if we're going to open up in respect to those, we need deliberate effort to do so. It doesn't just happen by talking about it. Also, going beyond our emphasis in the early days on framings, to realize that it's not just how individual social actors frame challenges of sustainability and solutions that we need to elicit with our methods, that entire societies become saturated with problematic imaginaries about history, about how the world is, about the many possible futures. So framings is also too small to get to grips with that. And then the sheer force of the globalized corporate and quite often behind the scenes military interests that shape these underlying imaginations that can easily get taken for granted in methods that presumes hierarchical scales, reductive focuses, and that sort of thing. So I was just banging on about how we came to realize on our own journey how important these deeper and more pervasive structures like coloniality, patriarchy, class exclusion, are, and that you have to, you can't just assume that methods for opening up in particular contexts using particular procedures will address the totality of these, and that it needs deliberate efforts. You need to name and challenge directly these kinds of forces. But it's important not to become too self-absorbed then, as with anyone on a journey, about our own particular biographies, because what I wanted to end with, really, because I think we've got limited time, is the journey. This is not a challenge to address these kinds of imperative is not a challenge of understanding, that somehow we have to find ways to make others understand more the complexities that we're seeing, because there are very good reasons why we had to go on this journey. That's very powerful structures in society find it very inconvenient for these kinds of questions to be raised. So therefore, it's not a question of ourselves moving on in some way so that we use new vocabularies and see these more nuanced insights I think we'll talk about today. We also need to catalyze others to come on the same journey. So that's made me realize it's not so much going from A to B as actually exploring a landscape and keeping a handle on some of the original ideas as well that help to catalyze those who are not in the same space, still locked into positivistic, instrumentalized approaches to sustainability, to help draw and catalyze and provoke those actors out of those spaces as well, to join in these deeper challenges, because it's not really just a deficit model of understanding, it's a struggle. And we've inherited this struggle from those who came before us. We've been inspired by so many before us, and we're pursuing it alongside us, all our many colleagues. And now, as this conference is focusing on, we're trying to pass it on. So it's a journey, but I think it's not just beyond methods to get to something else. It's making connections between methods and these broader underlying challenges. So thanks for the time in that.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Andy. So it's not that we're on a journey and we landed somewhere, but actually some of these things require ongoing engagement. Brilliant, thanks. So Injairu, over to you.
Yes. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to see some familiar faces in this space. Thank you, Andy, for starting us off. I think for me, I entered the conversation by just trying to bring into conversation the perspective of young change drivers in South Africa, on the continent, in the world, and how to work with this, and how we have been working with this, and what this means for moving beyond methods. I think that if we're going to move beyond methods, for me, one of the first things that we need to think very carefully about is how we think about time and space in research, and to really loosen it from this metronome of academia and institutions. Because ultimately, for me, I think it's really important that we get to a space where we can do enough deep listening for what remains unheard and possibly unsaid. And by this, I mean expressions towards wholeness and regenerative futures that evade us in the overculture. And for me, this implies a lot of surrender on the part of the role of the researcher in community with others. Surrender from the roles of taking and making that come from extractivist cultures of doing this, towards one more bent on unveiling what creative expressions already exist that are often concealed or reviled in the overculture. It means working more carefully, seasonally, in terms of our time-wise, to let things percolate enough for us to move together at the speed of trust. So I think that inquiry, if it's going to move beyond methodology, it has to really embrace and re-encounter the truths that are held in plain sight and what we know. And for me, I think it's about also imbuing the collective search for knowledge with, and mixing it together with the wisdom that already exists. And Nadim Godimer speaks about this around a sacred realism. And I think it's important to bring those two together and to open up our languages that can speak about this wisdom. And I can't see how we do that unless we foreground the soul in the way that we intimately gather, in the way that we see each other, in the way that we bring ourselves together. That seems very important in terms of moving beyond methodologies. For me, this entails shifting ourselves into new configurations of practice that are suitably strange. Dylan McGarry speaks about this, finding suitably strange ways of working. And for us, it's really been about creating decolonial rights as we go. We know we're at an impasse. What decolonial rights are going to help us open this up? And it instead becomes a space of rehearsal that we can play around the conditions for a paradigm of peace. The role of research, or the researcher for me, I think it's really important to think about, is moving beyond completely forgetting what you think that you're going to be doing there, and moving much more intimately into where you can be more helpful. And for me, it's been useful to think about the role of a midwife and what a midwife does. A midwife creates a beautiful, safe space for the labors that are happening to happen. And it's been very, very useful to think about the kind of moral intuition that comes with our research work and making the time for that. And meeting each other exactly where we are. And by this, I mean going beyond the sense of behavioral change being the pushback consistently, but actually just embracing where we are and the labors that we are a part of every day. And that includes releasing, as Andy spoke about, all of these colonial hangovers that we've all really been inculcated into, and reclaiming in embodied ways other ways of being. The relational dexterity that's required as a part of this is really, really important. Mutual vulnerability being one that I think that we need to talk much more carefully about. How do we do that? And for us, we've been experimenting a lot with the ancient technology of call and response music from across the world and in Africa. How we sing back to each other to encourage each other, and working creatively through song and seeing what that brings up. I lastly want to say in my fast flash 5 minutes that all of this work is just, the heart of this work is really about building new constellations of practice. And I think it's been very useful to use that as a kind of a litmus test for what we're doing. If what we're doing can't recede itself in ways that don't have anything to do with the narrative around scaling, but just receive itself generously towards a regenerative future, then it's really cause for concern in that way. So those are my opening thoughts.
Thanks so much, Injairu. Some really beautiful thoughts in there. And great to see people reacting in the chat. Thanks for that. David.
Thank you. I'm going to go a little bit more personal, and instead of explaining my journey, I'm going to speak my journey, and I haven't done spoken word on Zoom before. So I hope it's not too painful, but it will be only 5 minutes or less. And but it may require a different quality of attention and listening, perhaps a little bit away from the more analytical forms. So I'm going to speak my journey. At the beginning, too much movement from one project to the next, following the funds, following the grants. Methods granted closure through outcomes, through publications, closure for rewards, for recognition within our current academic ecosystem. And while closure is not wrong fundamentally, it can lead to extraction very easily. So I work hard trying to justify that my research was free from this extractive tendency. My research is for a good cause. My end game is to eventually make the world a better place, more just, to advance sustainability. Isn't knowledge by itself a good thing, y'all? And tried hard to minimize my extractivism. Through ethnography, participation is the key, modulating my own voice, my methods, bringing inclusivity, making room for other knowledges. My aim is transdisciplinarity. My ethics are strong. You say knowledge, I'll say power. You say thinking, I'll say doing. You'll say research, I'll say action. But 5 years ago, I was able finally to face my hypocrisy. The fact that reducing extractivism in the academy is like reducing inequality in capitalism. A band-aid, a cover, a cloak, a wrap. Capitalism and the academy are the progenitors of coloniality. And the extractive mentality harms not only the extractees, it also dehumanizes the extractors. It left me a sense of discontinuity, an inner hole, a lack of authenticity. Can we stop the money chase? Can we fold the parachutes? Stop the constant movement from one side to the next? My first step was to commit to a place, not just working with the community, but making the building of community the main goal of my work. Second step was to disembody the ecosystem of careerism, securing more funds, reading more papers. It's all important, and they fit our egos and CVs. But what is 1,000 papers worth when our home Mother Earth is in flames? Methods was third. Instead of closure, can we bring relationality? A learning separation, shifting our perception, where the system, no observers of the system, building ecocentric agency, mixing methods with ritual and ceremony, being inspired by nature and indigeneity. Under the umbrellas of steps, we have created conversatories with some Latin American friends. Lakshmi and Patty will talk later about them. At the conversatories, we learn together that decolonizing methods is more than anything about creating openings in our heads and in our hearts, openings to the cycles of life, openings to uncertainty and to the messy reality, opening to new seeds and to knowledge diversity, opening to love, to sisterly and brotherly love, to love of humanity as a whole, love of our nurturing planet. And let's not forget openings to fun by loosening or by losing our minds. Are you ready to join the new party? So that was it.
Amazing, David. That was fantastic. So it works very well. Brilliant. Thank you to everyone. Claps and lots of hearts and some nice reactions in the chat as well. So we have a chance to go back to each of the panelists to engage with what you heard from your colleagues. Anything that particularly resonated with you that you wanted to pick up on. Andy, I'll come back to you first.
Yeah, well, thanks to Injairu and David for these really inspiring talks. I'm so excited to talk about so many strands, really. But I would ask, really, if and somebody asked in the chat I saw about, hang on a minute, what are we actually talking about here? What are methods? And for me, methods on the face of it are means by which it is possible to come to understand situations, possibilities, issues, drivers better. That's the academic understanding of methods. And what we've been underscoring, and my colleagues really well, is how it's also about moving on to action, to engagement, and to more intimate acknowledgements of the nature of these problems. So then methods are doing at least a double work. We're talking about how they can, at the same time, as I was trying to say at the beginning, play this role to catalyze attention in these spaces that exist for understanding better the implications of sustainability, as well as helping to move people on the journeys that we've heard so eloquently talked about here. So for me, that's the real challenge. And for me, that's why I think thinking about, in the end, methods are forms of struggle. And if we think about them as forms of struggle, non-violent, caring struggle to bring others along with us, then I think we can maybe see ways to mix these things together. But I don't know if colleagues have got any thoughts about that kind of metaphor.
Thanks, Andy. Methods as forms of struggle. Injairu, David.
I'm sitting with that, forms of struggle. Yeah, I think forms of labor for me. I think struggle is such a strong word, and it has such a, there's something about trying to also open up the space for joy. And I think David's presentation held that I'd love to be also held within that when we speak about struggle, particularly from this context, coming from the legacies that we come from, what more can we open up in different ways? So I feel that sense of the struggle you're speaking about, but holding that little bit with it. Another thing that you spoke about, Andy, that made me think a lot in your piece was the sense of self-absorption, or how I understood is the paralysis that can happen as part of this work, and how to both do that deeply reflective, what I understand to be deprogramming work that's needed, and also be forward moving. That's something that comes up for me as something really important to keep our eye on. And David, in the way that you spoke, I'm so grateful for how you showed up in this space. It feels utterly refreshing. Thank you for centering a conversation around even just the hypocrisy of it, you know, and what it means to come to a sense of authenticity of the game that we're playing, and the structures that are in play, whilst trying to open up the space for love. Thank you for saying that word, you know. Yeah, parachutes. Sitting with that as well. Parachutes. I love that. That's what's just, yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks to both. I think it was a really good complement. The three presentations. This idea of methods as a forms of a struggle, perhaps also as a form of connection, as a form of building bridges, and the notion that it's a journey, but it's not a journey going from A to B. I think that's a powerful idea. I would even say it's more like a dance. It's not that methods in the way that we conventionally have been applying them. It's more like a journey from A to B, right? And that's the closure part. But method as a dance is more, you enter the stage, you see what people are there for, to dance with, and you have fun and things like that. And also something that Injairu mentioned is the notion of unveiling. I think this is important. Unveiling what is already there. Sometimes it's not that we need to create the future or anything like that. We need to unveil the potential that is already present. And shifting ourselves and moving into a more intimate space, right? That's another powerful idea that I have heard from, I think, both of you. And releasing the colonial hangovers, it's part of that intimacy. I think that's the intimacy is the antidote to to that, in a sense. And how we sing back to each other, and how we talk to each other, and being more aware of being aware, being more, self-reflection, of course, is a key element here. That's it.
Thanks so much, David, Injairu, and Andy. So there's a lot here to play with and react to. And what we wanted to do was essentially hand over some of this process to the collective. And so the way we're going to do that is playing a game we call the chat storm. So people have been posing some reflections, some questions, some thoughts in the chat. And so what we'll do is I'll start by choosing one of them and ask that person to unmute and share their thoughts. They can be questions, they can just be reflections. When they're finished sharing their own thoughts, they have to then pick somebody else who's put a comment into the chat and invite them to speak. And we can do this for about 10 minutes so that we start to weave the ideas coming out across us all. So if that's clear, I would like to start the chat storm. And I think, Laura, I'm going to pick on you. You've made a couple of comments in the chat, but I think really the one where you mentioned about how you find it difficult to embrace these methods with students. If you might like to unmute and share a bit more about that.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks to the speakers. I was just telling Lakshmi how I was intending not to talk during this for once, but here I find myself again. Yeah, chat storm. I think, the discussions that we've been having are so true, and yet I still struggle, particularly with my students who have to get degrees at the end of the day, and who specifically, within the South African context, it's expensive, right? You need to get a degree out the other side. You can't spend the sort of multiple years really getting involved, building the trust, that sense of connection with community. That I think a lot of the methods that we're discussing here really actually need and require. I mean, these are lifetimes of methodological practices, I think. And so for me, that's always been a big question about, like, how much do I let my students fall into this much more deeper connection while still holding on to them, and actually some of them are on this call now, to make sure that they do actually get the degree at the end of the day that they're there for. And I think maybe it's about potentially a bit of a reconfiguration of how we judge dissertations or theses, and I'm talking mainly at the graduate level now, not with undergraduates. I think there's potentially more scope to get them engaged in this way. But yeah, just that's been a struggle that I have, and would love to sort of open up to the rest of the group for thoughts and comments on here. But I think Sudimosa, you've also been commenting in the chat, so I think I'm going to pass over the baton to you.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks so much to everyone for their comments. I am not even sure I can add much more to what I already said. It's just sort of connecting Andy's sort of imploring us to look to the deeper structures. Injairu's thinking about sacred realism, lifting up soul, and then actually David doing just that in poetic ways, right? And it just makes me wonder, how do you survive in academia? You know, I already have removed myself sort of halfway out in many ways, and still keep one foot in it. And somehow I think I need that for some odd reason. I don't know, but I can so resonate with why add another, you know, any contribution to the exponential growth curve of academic papers that no one has time to review anymore, and they get worse and worse in quality, really. Or at least I don't know if there's any good ones out there, because I've lost overview. So it's just, you know, I just wonder, and the speed of trust, as you called it, Injairu, the speed of soul is a very different one than that exponential growth speed that we're now all experiencing. So I'm just struggling with, or wondering how you all survive in those deep structures that make you contribute more to that system when really everything inside you cries not to anymore. So how about Marisa or Rumgrad? I don't know who wants to speak. You have, I couldn't multitask, another one of my failures in this world. So how about Rumgrad, and I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name.
So that's an invitation for me.
Marisa, it looks like you're.
Okay.
Please.
Well, I was writing right now in the chat, like how to involve like young scientists with these new ideas, new pathways, new journeys, when the evaluations continue, as we all know, based on papers that Susan just mentioned. It's not the way to go. If we want to have an impact, if we want to really decolonize and change things, it's how to get them enthusiastic about these ideas, no? How to do that? Like, I feel I've been in academia for 30 years, and I think I have survived, but how for them to survive with this messy world, like Andy just said, no? How to do that? And it's part their compromise and their contribution, but they have to survive in this academic world. So how to do that? That's something that really worries me. And I want to share, like, at UNAM, like the enthusiasm that Andy has helped us to push in the graduate program in sustainability sciences, with very simple things like the walking seminars. It's something that was amazing for the students. So just a simple thing, that to walk and talk with them, that would be something that really has an impact in the group that we did that with. No, I just wanted to share that.
Thanks very much, Marisa. I wonder if Adrian Jenick, who I believe also has some ideas about ways to work with students, if you might like to share those. or Adrienne. Apologies if I
Sure, thank you. I was just saying that I began to realize that my students are so stressed and really having difficulties, that the ground is not even fertile for them to learn in a lot of cases, and trying to front load in my classes ways for them to understand how to connect and form trustful bonds, and really organize, like help to support them organizing as a community in the classroom, to not to break through any ideas of competition. I often now start out my classes saying that I assume that the students are all going to do excellent work and they're all starting out with A's. So to just take that off, that they can break down from there. I know this is not realistic in many other situations, but I've been experimenting with these ways, and I'm finding that it's really important, and that feels like the most important thing for them to understand how to make community, how to support each other, how to do these things, and that actually lifts up their research. It brings up challenges for me that I'm excited to take on after teaching for 30 years. At the end of the term, the idea of pushing them still comes forward. The idea of production, even though I've set this table of these other possibilities, I end up being challenged. So that's kind of what I have to share. But I'm excited to be able to be in a situation where I can do some experiments like this, and I'm encouraged by what's and love and really inspired by what the speakers lifted up and the other people have been sharing. So thank you. Do we have more time? Should I?
Thanks so much, Adrienne. I believe we don't. I think the message from Nathan came out that we have only a couple of minutes left. So Rose, we were going to come back to the panel. I just wanted to pick up on Susie's point in the chat about the question of do we need to survive in the academic space, or in fact are we part of transforming that from within? So I just think that's a really important point to raise. If you have, back to the panel at this stage, I'm unsure exactly how much time we have, but if you have a few very quick thoughts on anything.
Something inspired by Injairu and Debbie for me was, maybe it's not about, in order to survive, as it were, coloniality makes one think that the best one can do is survive. By actually aiming to flourish, then the kinds of things follow that I was inspired by in the earlier talks. And that means not just one thing, it means the methods, it's not a kind of a particular category of thing, it's something you do alongside other things. You know, coloniality makes us categorize, it makes us order, it makes us reduce and aggregate. So if we see ourselves as doing many things, it can be a journey of all the different kinds we talked about at the same time. And it's okay to be doing that in messy ways. That's something that helps me anyway.
Yeah, I really wish there was more time. There's so much happening. And Laura, you're putting things in the chat here. I'm just like, I mean, but I just wanted to speak about what it feels like, the aspect of the students that you're speaking about, which I also feel really, really dearly. What it feels like when you can see the assimilative culture of academia as it arrives in the face of beautiful young promise that can open up so much for us and what we're needing. And I think it's really important to signal that those cortisone levels around what academia means, especially when it's so dear, so expensive, or what it's supposed to do for us in the world and the time that we have together, it's so important to signal that cortisone levels, we can work to get those down so that you can get to ask the questions that are most important for you. How do we survive? Oh goodness, 1 minute. David, let me pass it on to you.
Well, I don't know how we survive. Yeah, I think when you are in the middle of a transformation and there is a transformation of a structure and you are part of this structure, the best thing you can do is to transform yourself and hope that the structure will get along. And if it becomes too oppressive, then of course the only option is to leave. But I think there are ways in which you can hold the oppression, stay with it, and hope that things, more people around you are going to do the same.
Brilliant. Well, thanks all for your very powerful, quick last thoughts. So thank you to everybody for joining us and for being part of this conversation. And I think they'll be sharing a little bit later the STEPS kind of legacy website, where some of the discussions and reflections from this year and many years of thinking about these issues will be shared. But thanks to Injairu, thanks to David, and thanks to Andy for your reflections, and everybody else.